Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Jane Clark, President of the Michigan West Coast Chamber of Commerce, and so happy to welcome you to our annual economic forecast. It's great you're with us today. Let me tell you what you can expect. We're going to start out with local and national economic reports, and then a special auto industry update as well. After our panelists make their presentations, we're going to have a moderated conversation with today's MC, and we're going to get to the questions that you submitted ahead of time when you were doing your registrations. There's also the opportunity to enter your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We don't know if we'll get to those today because we had so many pre-submitted questions, but if we don't, we will link you up with the panelists for follow-up. So we want to say a very special thank you to all of our program sponsors. Without their support, we could not make this program happen. And a very special shout out to TCF Bank, who's today's program sponsor, our presenting sponsor for this program. So you'll see all of the company logos on the screen in front of you. And again, thank you so much to today's sponsors. Now I'd like to introduce our guest MC. Kelly Springer is President and CEO of Metalflow Corporation here in Holland. Kelly also serves as Vice Chair of our Chamber's Board of Directors. So welcome, Kelly.
Good morning. I'm excited to join everyone today and very excited to hear from our panelists. One of the strengths of our chamber when we talk about the economy is the diversity of our membership. We have small businesses, large employers, and we all have a different lens on the economy. Our goal in our time together today is to recognize that some are feeling different challenges than others, but we'd like to ask our panelists to really kind of share both a large national view and take that and filter it down to how our local economy is impacted by the current conditions around us. So please join me in welcoming our panelists this morning. Our first presentation will be from Dr. Paul Eisley. Paul is well known in the economic community, and Dr. Isely is a very popular professor that many have heard speak in the past, and we're excited to have Paul kick us off this morning. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Eisley.
Thank you. So my job today is to set up where the economy is at, and we'll start here with that. And we have several different pieces we want to go through to help you understand where we're at. We are going to state the obvious. The economy fell into a deep hole at an unprecedented speed in late March 2020. This is important to understand because it was so deep and so fast that there is no historical precedent to what is going on. So it makes it much harder to look forward and see how those changes are going to affect us going forward. So what I'm going to do here today is I'm going to go through how the pandemic has influenced things for us. We're going to go through how the businesses are changing and improving as the year went along. And we're going to take a quick peek going forward. And then a little later on, we're going to delve right down into Ottawa County. If we look at this next piece, we have to let you know that this downturn, it's a virus and a public health response, not a broken economy. Our economy in 2007, 8, 9, 10 was broken. We had pits that were not working properly that had to be addressed. In this particular case, it's the reaction to a virus that's shutting us down. To see that in the next slide, we can see that when we hit March, we were just starting to see some restrictions on gatherings in restaurants and bars. And as we hit about the middle of the month, about the 23rd of March is when across the United States, most states went to a stay-at-home order. It seems like a long, long time ago now, but that's when it happened. And those stay-at-home orders were different in every state. For instance, only 20% of the states effectively listed construction as non-essential. Michigan was one of them. And in fact, Michigan had one of the most restrictive responses to the public health crisis. And a lot of that had to do with what was happening in Detroit. The bad news is that every time that a country around the world has gotten this under control, we see a second jump in cases, and it often starts in nightclubs and bars. So we can see a graph that shows this here. So the orange is the US hospitalizations, and we look at hospitalizations as opposed to new cases, because if you're sick enough to go to the hospital, you go to the hospital. If you're not sick enough to go to the hospital, you avoid the hospital. Unlike positive numbers can go up and down just because of testing. So the orange is the US. You can see those first couple little waves. Those are actually the first wave spread out across the entire United States. So it started in the Northeast and moved to the Southwest. And then you can see that big increase in the fall. That's read off the right-hand axis. So you can see right now there's about 120,000 people in hospitals. And that's the 7-day moving average. The good news is you can see that's coming down. The Michigan response, however, is in blue. So that first shutdown that was so hard, you can see it brought us down considerably. And we ended up having almost we had very few hospitalizations all summer long. And it really helped us take advantage of that beautiful summer weather along the lakeshore and really help some businesses recoup some of that initial loss, not all of it, and maybe get enough to make it through to this coming summer when we think things will loosen up. And then you can see the second piece that started to happen when it got cold and people started to move inside. And it started coming down in early December, and the hospitalizations have been dropping ever since. This is good news. So how did that affect the economy? If you look at the US economy on the next graph, you can see that initial impact caused that big drop down in employment. So this is employment compared to January 2020 as we go all the way through the year. And you can see that by the end of the year, goods producing were down only 4%. And service providing were down a little over 8%. But in April, they were down 14% and 12%. Now remember those numbers because the next slide is Michigan. And here you can see we were down 25% and 35%. That's the impact of that really hard shutdown that we had at the beginning of the year. However, you can see that we came back pretty quickly. And at this point, we're trending just a little bit below what the rest of the country is. And you can see that service and goods producing are behaving about the same here in Michigan, which is really interesting given the dichotomy we see in the rest of the country. So we'll talk about that a little later on. But I have part of the reason for all of this change was the massive government stimulus that we had. This was just unprecedented. It's an overused word this year and last year, but think about it this way. The initial response was $2 trillion. The second response was $1 trillion. And now they're asking for about another $2 trillion. That adds up to $5 trillion. That's more than the government spends in any given year. If we spend all of that money in about a year, the last time that we had an increase in government spending 1 year over the next that was that large was World War II. So this was a massive fiscal response by the government. And you can see that in the next graph because this is disposable personal income. This is the income that people have after taxes. And you can see that it has been slowly going up. And in fact, if we go back to the beginning of this time series, it just is this slow, steady upward trend until you get to April 2020, when all of a sudden personal income just shoots off the graph. And it's doing that because of all of that stimulus money, the $1,200 checks, the extra $600 a week, all of those types of components. And you can see it stayed elevated all summer long. So we saw that we really didn't start returning back to the trend line and dropping below the trend line until we reached November and December of last year. And then we have a second set of stimulus now coming in. So in the next graph, you can see what this has done to the potential of consumers. You can see that their savings, and this is an annualized savings, so they didn't save $6 trillion, they saved an annual, if they had saved at that rate all year long, they would have saved $6 trillion. But you can see this massive increase in savings. But what I want you to see is here at the end of the year, they still had twice as much savings as they did at the beginning of the year. And in fact, that we saw that across many different ways you cut income. So even those at the bottom 25%, on average, were showing more savings than they had at the beginning of the year. This doesn't mean everybody is better off, but it means that there's a lot of money in the economy to help things restart. All right, I want to do this next graph because I get this asked all the time. What about U6? Somebody in Michigan talked about U6 and now everybody is fixated on it. This is a broader measure of unemployment that includes underemployed people, discouraged workers, those types of things, all right? And it's always much higher than regular unemployment. But I want to show you how this broader measure of unemployment has reacted. So here you can see this broader measure of unemployment went up to 25%, and it's now down to 11.7%. But what I want you to see is the last recession, it took 72 months from the time it first crossed 11.7 to the time that we fell back below 11.7. This time, it took 8 months. These are much different things happening between these two recessions. And what we're seeing right now is a lot of underlying strength in the economy. So next graph. So I want to do manufacturing versus services quick. And that will help us lead into automotive. So first of all, manufacturing has been doing pretty well. We exited 2019 in a shallow manufacturing recession. So this is the 12-month moving average, the orange. The blue is the 3-month moving average, so long run average versus short run average. If blue is below orange, then the economy is slowing down. So what we can see here is that it was slowing down in manufacturing. And then we started to see us start to recover at the very end of the year. And then we started to have the supply chain problems and then the shutdowns that really led to a big drop off in new orders. But what we can see now is we ended the year relatively strong with new orders. Now we were getting some anecdotal evidence that things sort of really slowed down at the very end of the year. We haven't seen that in the data yet. And we're curious as to whether that's just everybody just took a breather at the end of the year and then restarted, or is that a reset? So we'll be watching for that. But we ended the year really, really strong. And a lot of that had to do with automotive. So next graph, please. Restaurants, on the other hand, and venues and things like that have a completely different story. So here you can see they were trending year over year. Restaurant sales were up, and then we had the shutdown. And you can see year over year in April, they were down 50%. All right. And then it took a few months and they got back up about a little more than half of that. And then they've been slowly improving since that point until the last few months, which we don't have data for, where they would have started to trail off again. But what you have to see is that in Michigan, in this time frame where after we came back, so late summer, we still had 18 to 20% of local restaurants closed. So these aren't the chain restaurants. These are the small restaurants that you have that create the character of the area. All right. Then as we reach the end of the year, the next click will show you that we're now down 30% of local restaurants closed, and we're near 60% of bars and restaurants closed. And we have entertainment venues closed. The second dip, what we're hearing is it was far worse than the first one. All right. So what do we see going forward? So we have that manufacturing side that's doing pretty well, and we have that services side that's struggling a little bit. And we can see that when we ask people across West Michigan, or when we ask business leaders across West Michigan. You can see that nearly 50% of those business leaders say that they're going to hire over 2021 at greater than a 3% rate. That's amazing. But at the same time, we have 22% who say they're still going to be shrinking. And we can see that in the next graph, where we see that we still have 22% of firms, excuse me, not 22%. 22% of firms that say that they will not be back to pre-COVID levels by the end of 2022. But we have over 40% who say that they'll be back by July 21st. So we're seeing this dichotomy in the economy, and a lot of that has to do with the strength that we're seeing in manufacturing, particularly in automotive. And some of the weaknesses that we see there really has to do with what we're hearing is we could go faster if the supply chain could handle it. So I think with that, we're going to switch over.
Great. Thank you, Paul. As I mentioned early, we have a lot of diversity in our membership base within the Chamber. And we also have that interconnected activity between various industry groups. West Michigan specifically is known for manufacturing, and automotive manufacturing is a key to that, and it also provides a big economic influence that supports many sectors: housing, retail, restaurants. And so if you spend time in the automotive space, you may know our next panelist. Mike Wall is a director with IHS Markit and a resident expert on all things automotive. So he's going to share a view of what 2021 looks like from that space, and how then that will play into our local economy as we move forward in 2021.
Thank you, Kelly. Appreciate everybody's attending this webinar, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity to present our latest outlook for the industry. And I think it will dovetail in nicely with a lot of the topics that Paul discussed even in his lead into this. So if we go to actually 2 slides in, we'll skip over the marketing slide. I gotta include the marketing slide in there because I'm bound thoroughly. Let's kick it off talking about our global light vehicle sales outlook. And again, I'm not gonna spend a lot of time in the minutia of the global side, but I wanna frame the discussion. Paul touched on a lot of great points in terms of how this downturn is different than 08, 09, and it is for automotive as well in a couple different ways. On the one hand, the downturn last year was actually more severe in a unit perspective, even though it was much different in terms of the causes and that sort of thing. And Paul mentioned it was a pandemic. It was caused by a virus. And the difference now versus 08, 09 is it took the world down. And we saw China decline. We saw India decline. So at the end of the day, we saw a stunning decline in vehicle sales, about 14%, 77 million units. Just to give everybody a frame of reference, January of last year, our expectation for the year was to be down just under 1%. So it was night and day, obviously, January last year versus obviously how the year transpired. Going forward, now we're starting to dig out of that hole. We're starting the snapback. The snapback is different in different regions. That's why you hear all this talk about is a U-shaped recovery, V-shaped recovery, W, K, every letter in the alphabet. As it relates to automotive, that letter is going to be different in different markets as well. Let's go into the next slide. So when we talk about the U.S. light vehicle sales environment, that's really, I think we'll get into the nitty gritty, especially for our suppliers here in West Michigan and on the lakeshore, in terms of what's driving your sales. The vehicles that you're producing components for, obviously it's driven by vehicle sales. U.S. light vehicle sales, I think it is fair to say we're in more of a V-shaped recovery, for lack of a better term. And I will also admit that if you were to ask me in March and April and May of last year, I had a much different outlook. I mean, we as a company were arguably more reticent to expect a quicker snapback like we have seen. But what we have seen is consumers have re-engaged the market with pure vigor, especially on the retail side. On the daily rental sales side has been very challenged, there's no doubt, and that's not going to come back in the next probably year or two in terms of daily rental sales, and that's a significant component of the market. But even within that weakness, we've seen retail really outperform. Again, last year we ended the year at about 14.6 million units. Again, that's not positive. I'm not trying to color it other than the fact that it was an ugly year. Could have been worse though. Our expectations coming into the year for the year though was about 16.8. So obviously the reality was much different than the expectation in January. However, you flash forward to this year, we're sitting at 16.1 million units. That's our expectation. And the one thing I think, ironically enough, that might challenge that is inventory. Do we have the vehicles to sell? We've seen strength in used vehicle sales, strength in used vehicle pricing. That augurs well for new vehicle sales as well. And we have this wild card. I think Paul's been alluding to it. We've got the wild card of the Biden administration and some of the stimulus measures that they may enact, may get through Congress. That could stimulate a bit further as well. But even in the absence of that, again, we're sitting about 16.1 million units with some possible assist as we end the year and going into next year with that daily rental category and some other segments. Speaking of segments, though, car and truck, one thing that has not changed and was not altered by the virus, and in fact maybe accelerated, was the shift towards light truck. So I think crossover utility vehicles, sport utility vehicles, and pickup trucks, that is only intensified. And we're getting to a point where the market is going to be about 80-20, 80% light truck, 20% passenger car. And that we expect to continue again, for the foreseeable future. Let's go to the next slide. So now we talk about sales. Let's talk about production. Production, that's what moves the needle for suppliers in this region. That's what moves the needle, frankly, for other businesses. Because again, as those suppliers are building parts, they're obviously doing business, and that has that multiplier effect to the broader region. Production-wise, there's good news and bad news. Good news is that we're digging out of this hole very quick. Production is snapping back quickly. Bad news is production is snapping back very quickly. If you look back in 08, 09, it was a more measured recovery. That allowed and afforded suppliers to kind of build back up into those volumes, and automakers as well. Flash forward to now, and what we are starting to see is tightness. We're seeing tightness in labor. And again, for a lot of the suppliers I'm talking to, they're having a challenge finding that skilled trades and that skilled labor to really work the lines, if you will. Probably even more important right now is component shortages. And I'm sure for anybody who's covering autos right now, working in the auto business, you're hearing about those semiconductors and some of that semiconductor shortage. The reality within automotive, we have thousands of parts in a vehicle. It only takes one. It only takes one part to take us down. That part right now happens to be these very small, wafer-thin semiconductors. It is having a material impact, so I don't want to downplay it. I will say the impact has been more pervasive in Asia, Greater China, some of the other Asia markets, and then to an extent Europe. It is impacting us here in North America, though, so I don't want to, again, I don't want to short sell it. You look at first quarter, we did recently revise our forecast down for first quarter by about 39,000 units, again, for first quarter production. That's all reflected here in our forecast. But we do expect to recover much of that in the back half of the year. We may see this, the reality is we may see the headlines remain fairly challenged, though, at least through this quarter and maybe into the early part of the second quarter. The good news is we do still have some dry powder in terms of capacity to make up a lot of that lost production in the back half of the year. The challenging part, though, and I alluded to it earlier, is inventory is tight. Inventory is tight, and that's another key distinction now versus 2008, 2009. We entered that Great Recession in 08, 09 with too much inventory, and it took us time. We had to burn through that inventory, and that, again, all kind of contributed to the fall off. Here, when you take production down like we did last year for a good 8 to 9 weeks, that inventory situation cleared itself up very quickly, and now we're kind of finding ourselves having to rebuild. And we've been going through that process all through last year. The reality was vehicle sales held up so well that every month we'd go by trying to build that production back up. We weren't quite making up enough ground. So that's what we're looking for this year, is really kind of lighting all of those plants up and really starting to rebuild that inventory level. And we do expect that to happen. And that's, again, contributing to the fact that we see production getting back to 2019 volumes this year. So basically 1 year's time, 16.3 million units this year, growing to 16.7 in 2022. Again, as we go looking forward, we've got more onshoring here, more transplant manufacturers bringing production into North America. The USMCA obviously taking hold. That's going to have certainly a beneficial factor, especially to the US as well. In fact, let's go to the next slide. It dovetails in nicely to this slide. Here we take a look at North American production by country. So again, some things to take away for Western Michigan and Lakeshore suppliers is growth in terms of US production is looking really good between now and 2028. In fact, when you look at between 2019 and 2028, I took 2020 out of the mix because it is a bit of an anomaly. We're growing US production by about 770,000 units. Again, great news for the industry. But even beyond that, you look at Mexico holding at about par, down about 57,000 units relative to 2019, but still a sizable component. And Canada, we have Canada contracting by about 300,000 units, but there's a bit of an asterisk there. Canada is also starting to become a bit of a toehold, if you will, for electric vehicle production. For anybody who's seen some of the negotiations with Ford and the Canadian Auto Workers Union, or even General Motors, there's a lot of electrified activity going on even in Canada, in addition to the US. So again, it's going to matter. It's going to depend on what programs you're targeting, but that will certainly contribute to some of those growth prospects as well. Let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about it by automaker type. And here I've just broken it up amongst Detroit 3, transplant automakers, which are in green, and then that blue is kind of what we call the startups. These are obviously it's the Tesla and the Rivians of the world, but it's also Lucid Motors Zoox and Arrival and Canoe and all these crazy names that we didn't hear about a year and a half ago. Those guys are embedded in that blue area. But going back to the green area, green and red. So the Detroit 3, an interesting thing happened in 2019. That was the year we got to parity between the transplant manufacturers and the Detroit 3. They basically equaled each other out in terms of production. This year, actually, the Detroit 3 will actually exceed transplants we expect by a couple 100,000 units. Again, part of that's that inventory rebuilding. And then it'll be off to the races, where we do see the transplant manufacturers gaining sort of a dominant, not a huge domination, but certainly a majority production within North America. Again, that's key in terms of thinking about your addressable market and who you want to go after, target new business. And we're not advising anybody to steer clear of the Detroit 3 by any means. 7.7 million, 7.8 million units of production for the Detroit 3 is very positive. That's going to be some strong, highly profitable programs, by the way, because the automakers of the D3 have been kind of steering away from passenger cars, which are less profitable and frankly more volatile in terms of production. But in terms of growth, certainly we see transplant manufacturers growing about 350,000 units out to 2028. And then those key startup categories. Again, Tesla right now is the lion's share, but there's a lot of new product coming. Rivian, and then some of those other, either call it mobility as a service providers and electrified vehicle manufacturers as well, are embedded in there as well. Lower volume, so they're not of the scale of Tesla quite yet, but a lot of new players, and there's more coming that we're continuing to monitor and evaluate for inclusion in the forecast. Go to the next slide. Now, one other side, so we talk about the unit volumes, and that gets a lot of the headlines. That really moves the storylines when we say production's down 20% or sales are down X%. The thing that doesn't get talked about nearly as much, but that certainly suppliers on the front lines feel, are the delays, program delays. And boy, we really felt it last year. Obviously, when you take a plant down for 8 to 9 weeks, that's going to impact your launch schedule. So there is sort of that near-term impact. But more importantly, what we're seeing now is the intermediate, call it intermediate-term impact. So that's why I've kind of highlighted that 2021 to 2023 timeframe. We're seeing a lot of tweaking going on in launch schedules. Why are we seeing that? We're seeing automakers stretching cadence a bit to try to absorb those program costs a little bit longer, because we took a hit in production last year. So that amortization, we need to amortize those program costs as much as we can. Also prioritizing profitable programs, trying to extract as much profitability as you can out of those programs before absorbing more launch costs, if you will. And then frankly, there's that battery electric vehicle activity, and it is coming. It's coming with a vengeance, really starting this year, but really intensifying through 2025. And that is not abated through all of this. So we see that as an ongoing trend really through our forecast horizon. So, hold on to your hats. The electric vehicles are coming. If you were to ask me 5-6 years ago, we were saying it's going to be a more measured process over, the better part of a decade. Well, you flash forward to now, we're nearing that sort of 2/3 to 3/4 part of that decade call. That's when the deluge is starting. Let's roll to the next slide. And really, that's kind of manifested here. I take a look at our powertrain technology outlook. I also included Europe and mainland China in here to give everybody kind of a relative performance. Where does the U.S. stand globally with some of the other major markets? But I'm going to hone in on the U.S. because, again, that's driving a lot of the business that suppliers are seeing in this region. And first and foremost, if you look at that sort of pastel green area, that's your electrified vehicle. That's your full battery electric vehicle, your Teslas, your Mustang Mach-E, those type of vehicles. First thing I want to get through is look at 2020, it was about 2% mix in terms of US vehicle sales of just pure battery electric vehicles. It's going to grow. It's going to grow sizably. 2025 is going to be 9%. 2030 is going to be 15%. That's our estimation based on the new models coming down the pike. There are some wild cards in the mix. The Biden administration, how do they look to possibly stimulate electric vehicle adoption through more electrical charging infrastructure, vehicle charging infrastructure, maybe incentives and things like that? There's some potential for some upside to that. But notice the difference in the sort of the dichotomy when you look at it versus the EU 28, so Europe and mainland China. It is a much different measure of progress in those markets. Obviously, we're seeing an explosion of growth in Europe, again, really driven by fuel economy and emissions regulations. Same thing with mainland China with a lot of the incentive programs they've been running. We're expecting much greater adoption, at least in the intermediate to longer term. But again, that's not to give too much short shrift to the U.S. because again, those models are starting to come. General Motors is obviously pushing it very heavily. Ford is as well. We're seeing that on the Ford front, and then those new startups. So, you know, Tesla, Rivian, and the raft of new product coming down the pipe. This isn't meant to say that internal combustion is going away. So for anybody producing parts on, you know, gas engines or diesel or exhaust, it's not going away. But we have to be mindful of the fact that this new product is coming down the pike, and it will start to disrupt. It already is to some extent, but it will be intensifying. Let's go on the next slide. This is my last slide, just to kind of sum it up. Again, in the extreme near term, and again, like Paul's unprecedented, my overused word is volatility, or maybe extreme volatility, but it's a reality. And that's going to be our near-term watchword, is trying to manage through the supply chain, if you will. The good news is the demand is there. And again, we're seeing very good green shoots, if you will, on the demand side, or you know, stability, or there's legs to this demand story. We got to get the product out there. And that's where component shortages, labor availability, raw material pricing, that's all factored into the mix. And we have to be particularly careful around supplier distress. I've got that in there as a watchword. You know, we continue to monitor it. I'll tell you though, going through last year, you know, suppliers were I think, well positioned going into this downturn, certainly much better so than the 08-09 timeframe. So that's good news. Beyond this current cycle, we do expect to see growth rates to eventually subside. And that's when the industry really starts to focus on electrification, safety, autonomy, and even some of those new mobility dynamics. That has been deferred maybe a little bit further out because of the virus. Scale is going to be a big deal. FCA, PSA is obviously the big story right now, but it's going to be even beyond those. We're going to see more, obviously, joint ventures in addition to merger and acquisition and more partnerships. And that's really been another watchword that we've been following very closely. With that, I'll turn it back over to Paul.
All right, so we just need to loop that all back around to Ottawa County and what that all means for Ottawa County. We do know that automotive across West Michigan influences 1 in 5 jobs. So still today, 1 out of 5 is still coming from automotive. All right, so the tagline here is Ottawa County is behaving differently, just like it did out of the last recession. So Ottawa County led West Michigan out of the last recession, and it is taking that standard again this time. So give me the next slide. So I want you to just note here where we stand. You have to do year over year. I can't do month because this stuff isn't seasonally adjusted at a county level. But you can see the unemployment number is elevated by a little more than 1,500. The employment number is down about 3,500. And then we have a decrease in the total labor force. So we have people who are near retirement who just said, I'm hanging it up, I'm going. You had people who had to leave the labor force to go care for children. And you had people who were just too nervous, too concerned to go back to the type of job that they were doing. All right, so your total labor force is around 160,000. So notice that your total employment is down just over 3,500. So if you click the next button, based on our surveys of people across West Michigan, the projection will be that at the November of 2021 compared to November of 1999, that we will actually have an increase in employment. So we will be back to pre-COVID levels this year in Ottawa County is what we're looking at right now. And there's a lot of ifs. So we're still looking for really the ability for businesses to really reopen much more wide scale as we hit around July. We're still looking at that there's enough people willing to work. So we might not even have enough people to build this back. So there's going to be severe pressures on employment. We expect this year that there'll be likely a $15 minimum wage pushed through at the national level, given what we see in Washington. And that will affect how we see some of those low-income workers coming back. All right. So on the next line, for those people who still do have their jobs, so aren't unemployed, what we can see is that their average weekly earnings is higher now than it was before. So you can see that drop down in earnings, or in the growth of earnings. And what we can see here is that we're accelerating out here in 2020. We've had a 3.7% increase in hourly wages and a 2.3% increase in hours, because again, as you come out of a recession, you tend to increase working the workers you have as opposed to hiring new workers. So that's not for all businesses, but in fact, if you look at retail, their hours are down and their wages are up. And when you combine the two, they're down just a little bit. So, but when we look at all workers across the spectrum, it's up. Why is it up? So if we look at the next slide, you can see a lot of this has to do with manufacturing. Manufacturing workers didn't lose their jobs at the same rate. And we can see here that in your three major working locations across the county, Holland and Zeeland and Spring Lake Grain Haven are both 40% of their jobs are in manufacturing, all right? And that is almost 70% of the workforce for Ottawa County. So you can see that manufacturing jobs didn't disappear at the same rate that we saw some of those service jobs disappear. And that really is generating value that is actually helping support those non-manufacturing jobs, because those people have money and they're able to go and spend it. Notice Hudsonville is a little different. They're really, in many ways, and I know they don't like it when I say this, but in many ways, they're a bedroom community for Grand Rapids. So they're much more closely linked to the Grand Rapids economy than they are to the Holland economy. All right. So all of this has resulted in housing really holding up. Now, I can't show you day-to-day in Ottawa County and have it be statistically valid. I can and can't. So what I'm doing here is to show you that between 2000 and 2019, that realistically, Ottawa County and Kent County's housing prices really behaved in much the same manner. So the same house selling in one year versus the next, how much did it go up? And we can see that in 2019, you needed to spend a little over $150 for every $100 that you would have had to spend for the same house in the year 2000. All right, that's pretty good house inflation. Here's the last recession. Notice that in this recession, we may not see that. So I'm going to show you Kent County, where there is enough houses for us to do things month to month. So give me the next slide. And what we can see here is that as we go up through the year, prices continued to rise. We saw that here. We saw that in Ottawa County. We saw that across the state. It continued to go up in center cities, so people weren't vacating because of the virus. But we were seeing extensive growth outside the center cities as people were trying to move out of those areas, out of being close to other people. And they still had money because they still had their job. So we saw that acceleration in those types of houses here at the end of the year. So I think the next slide, we'll get to the very end. I'm going to give you the warnings to all of what I'm talking about here. So give me the next slide. Do not watch unemployment. It doesn't matter. It is all messed up because of all sorts of different statistical problems, and also because of that change in the size of the labor force. You should be watching hospitalizations for COVID. That will tell you whether the economy can reopen and whether it can reopen strongly. You should be watching passenger miles for airlines and border closures. That will tell us whether that supply chain will start to break loose across the world. And I normally don't care at all about consumer expenditures because they're the last ones to know that something's changed. But this time, when they start to spend that savings, that's when we'll really start to kick off. And some of the sociologists that I've been reading have been talking about this pent up desire to spend and do the things that you weren't doing. And so it's really looking like we could have a really strong second half of the summer because of that. So my last warning is the next slide. So as a result of everything that we're seeing this is not a size, this is a risk. So think about it this way. The Federal Reserve gets to decide a little bit as to whether it's increasing interest rates or increasing prices. They've already signaled that they're going to let prices rise more than they traditionally did to try and heat the economy up. What we see here is a risk for increase at a higher level than we've seen at any time since the late 1970s. All right. And so we should expect that you'll start to see prices start to rise and that you're going to see long-term interest rates start to rise. And what the balance of those two is going to depend on how much people want to save money in the United States from other countries, how much the Federal Reserve is willing to defend prices, and how much more debt we're going to put on in the federal level. But we can say right now that you should expect prices going up and being above that 2% range, probably around that 3% range. And those interest rates will start to come up from these record lows. This is all because the economy is heating up. So this is a symptom of the fact that we're going to be going pretty strong as we hit the end of this year. So I think that pretty much summarizes where we're at. The US and the Michigan economies will likely reach pre-COVID levels in the second half of 2022. But Ottawa County is looking, at least by some measures, that you're going to reach it before the end of this year. All right, so I think we're up to questions.
All right. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Mike, for that information. Now we've received a number of questions that have come in as part of the pre-submission prior to our time together today. And one of those that I wanted to start with and get some thoughts on, Paul, maybe you have a perspective on this, is really focused on our retail, our restaurants, tourism, and how that plays into our local economy. We've talked about the workforce and the makeup of the workforce in the area and unemployment, but obviously those industries and those members of the chamber are clearly impacted as well by tourism. Maybe speak to that.
Yeah, so tourism in West Michigan is driven by a more regional tourism. So we're looking at Chicago, we're looking at Michigan, Northern Indiana. Those are the places that are going to be coming for that West Coast experience. And what we see, and we saw at the second half of summer this year, was that people didn't want to get on an airplane. Their other plans were canceled, and being outside was a pretty good option. The activities that relate to that within Ottawa County are expansive, and we're going to see that again this summer, except it's going to start earlier in the summer than it did last summer. So what we do know is that a lot of businesses have gone out of business. We know a lot of restaurants have gone out of business, and we know that those that make it to summertime are going to see a good tourism pop, I think, as people are just tired of sitting at home watching the same four walls. And that's going to be a big driver for your economy as you head into summer.
Great, thank you. Mike, we talked in your presentation a lot about the supply chain, and there are many businesses along the lakeshore that support the supply chain. And throughout COVID, the resilience of that supply chain, and you noted some of that, what are you most excited about in terms of the strengthening of the supply chain and maybe localization efforts that we'll see as we enter 2021?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And you're right. I mean, the resiliency of the supply chain was really in full array. Last year, we saw suppliers and automakers alike really restart the engines, if you will, after the shutdown with, a sheer will of force. So that was great news. We've been able to kind of navigate a lot of the challenges. And again, I talked a little bit about some of the component shortages. That's the reality of kind of restarting the process. In fact, I'm a little surprised we didn't have other issues like that. So I think it's good news to some extent on that end. I think what gives us even further hope going forward as well, for as much as it was a political football, and I know USMCA, NAFTA, now USMCA was, battered about, but net at the end of the day, I think it will lead to more onshoring, if you will, lead to more opportunities to bring more content here to the U.S. Now, we can debate, is it going to be a one-for-one in jobs or what have you? Will there be, I do think there will be still increasing trends towards automation, but I do think we're going to bring more of that content onshore here. And it's not just because of USMCA either. It's automakers, I think, are finding themselves for a long time. We talk about globalization. I would talk about global light vehicle platforms and all of that. And there's still an element to that, but there's also been a return to, dare I say, a little bit of a regionalization, where automakers are finding a benefit, a value in having a known supply chain closer to their operations. Not necessarily de facto, we're going to do that part in China. We're going to do that tooling in China. Yeah, it's still in the mix. It's still part of the valuation and the evaluation process. But this, by the same token, supported further by USMCA, is bringing those questions and those decision points, I think, a little bit closer to home, which I think dovetails in nicely to us here in West Michigan.
Great. Both of you are welcome to answer the next question that was submitted, and that's, when we look at our economy, what permanent changes do you see in terms of how we operate and do business that potentially impact our local economy in a post-COVID environment?
Well, I guess I'll start. We see a lot of changes that are happening, and one of them we were talking about even before this happened. One of the things people have learned in this economy is how to do things online. And one of the things that we said would happen at the end of this recession, even before we knew when it was going to happen, was that workers who were doing transactional jobs, people who were moving a piece of paper from one person to another, were going to be in less demand than they were before. So those jobs will start to disappear. Why? Because you can replace them with AI, you can replace them with blockchain, you can replace them with technologies that we were all playing with. So we've already seen banks talk about closing branches. We've seen already lots of spending on automation, and that's also going to be accent if we see a higher minimum wage. So one of the things we're going to see is those transactions now are going to be much more automated than they were before. And that's just going to be a new normal, also a word overused. And the second place we know is that your work culture is going to change. So one of the things that we see is that people are holding off on furniture purchases, also another big issue here in West Michigan. And they're doing that because they don't know what their office is going to look like a year down the road. So commercial real estate went from having 5-year leases and higher to now when people re-up, they're doing 1 year or even less. And they're doing that because they want to sort of wait this out to see how much space they really do need. And then they're going to have to figure out how to reconfigure it. So there's going to be a few-year lull here while people figure out what a new office looks like. There'll be people in offices. They're not all going to be at home looking at Zoom, but it's going to be different. So we know those two things are going to be happening.
I would make one other note to that speaks to the automotive side, and something that we're evaluating closely is kind of what we're living through right now. And Paul mentioned we're not going to go to completely work from home, but we may start to see continued shifting of households away from some of the metropolitan areas to more suburban and maybe quasi-rural, which I think is positive towards vehicle demand. And that's a completely different shift than what we saw basically going into 2019. And we in automotive, we're thinking, boy, with all this, shift towards urbanization, you don't need as many vehicles per garage. You don't need, these are some nuances, especially in the US, which is such a heavily fleeted market, for lack of a better term. We've got 280 million vehicles running around on the road. That can move the needle a little bit as well from a vehicle demand perspective.
Great. Let's talk taxes. It's a time of year where, as we plan with a new administration, any recommendations or economic indicators in terms of timing of purchases. Business leaders many times look at tax as a part of the decision-making process and making investments. And any lens from what you're hearing or seeing from an economic perspective on that topic going into 2021?
Yeah. So number one, talk to your accountant, because I'm not an accountant. That's what I do. But what do we see on the big picture? Number one, we know that taxes are going to be going up. There's no way that you have the amount of spending that we have. There's no way you have an administration that's focused on income and wealth disparity that we have without seeing taxes change. Right now, it will really depend on the senator from West Virginia as to how big those will change. So in the last election cycle, from really these economic perspectives, the most powerful person in the Senate now is from West Virginia, because he's the centrist that's there. So we're watching him very carefully to determine how big the taxes will change. But we know corporate taxes will change, and we know tax rates for those, particularly in the top half, likely will change, and they will likely do so pretty quickly. We also know that we're going to be moving towards a higher interest rate environment. It might not be a high interest rate environment, but it's going to be a higher interest rate environment. So I think those costs of capital are going to, of purchasing new capital, are going to increase over the course of the next 2 years.
So we obviously have heard about a number of challenges. You mentioned minimum wage, and I'm sure that's raising questions that we'll want to share with members of the chamber moving forward, and how that impacts the businesses, along with a number of other challenges. As we wrap up today, I'd like to ask each of you to close with what you're most optimistic about, what you're most excited about as we enter the first month of 2021 with the whole year behind us. What really brings you optimism about our West Michigan economy?
Okay, I'll start. Sorry, Mike. What were we most excited about? I think it's that we really are seeing that very blended economy that we've developed in West Michigan be resilient to this big hit. And it's been resilient to this big hit more than the rest of Michigan, and in most of the cases more than the rest of the United States. So that in of itself is going to result in the fact that we're going to come back faster. It doesn't mean that all industries come back. It means that we're still going to be missing businesses that we used to go to when we hit summer. But there's going to be new opportunities because of the wealth that we've drawn into this region. That's what makes me excited.
Yeah, I can only echo that. The resiliency factor, I think, is huge. I think that I take that to heart every time I go and walk through the plants at the suppliers on the lakeshore and in West Michigan, broader West Michigan. So I look forward to us, again, getting back to that quote unquote normal at a much more rapid clip than, frankly, other regions and frankly, even other parts of the U.S., frankly, as well. And being a car guy, I just look forward to seeing more of everybody's parts going into these new cars that are being launched. So just stay tuned. The launches are coming, and it's going to be a fun ride.
All right, thank you. Jane, we'll turn it back to you to wrap us up.
Well, great. Thank you. A series of thank yous here. I want to say thank you to Kelly Springer for being our moderator. Paul Eisley and Mike Wall, thank you for sharing your insights and your optimism as we move forward in 2021 and think about resiliency of our community and our nation. I want to say a thank you to all of our sponsors that made today's program available today, and especially to TCF National Bank for being our presenting sponsor. Thanks for joining us. Have a remarkable day.